When George Washington was president in the 1790s, he did not believe in intervening in other nations' affairs. 100 years later, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the United States was intervening all over the world. This was known as the American Empire. Welcome to Lessons in Humanities. For PowerPoints, Google Slides, primary source activities, full course curriculum, and other teaching and learning materials, visit the Lessons in Humanities store. Let's look at some of the reasons why the U.S. intervened. Now, first of all, the American Empire wasn't like the Roman Empire or the British Empire. It was an extension or expansion of American influence around the world. In the 1790s, it moved west, and this was known as the Manifest Destiny. This was from the 1790s and early 1800s. And in the late 1800s, the U.S. needed new markets for industrial and agricultural surpluses. So it went from Western expansion to other countries. The U.S. also needed raw materials for manufacturing. They also wanted to compete with Europe, and they had strategic military objectives. They also had this sense of civilizing, in quotation marks, and a genuine desire for humanitarian assistance. This time period starts with the Spanish-American War, right? So before this, it was Manifest Destiny in the 1800s going west, and then the Spanish-American War is kind of the beginning of this American empire, which was the war with the Spanish in Cuba and also the Philippines against Spain. And then it would extend to the Philippine-American War in the early 1900s. And then there's the Roosevelt Quarterly, which was going to extend the power and influence of the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere. The Mexican Revolution is going to be in the early 1900s, which is going to coincide or happen at the same time as World War I, which the U.S. did not want to intervene but would intervene. And then in the 1920s is the Roaring Twenties, which is the next time period. Now let's look at the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. So economic, military, and cultural engagement went back to the 1700s, but the Spanish-American War, which was in 1898, and the Philippine-American War, which was in 1899 to 1902, was a turning point in American interventionism. The United States increased its global reach at this time. The Spanish-American War and Philippine-American War made Americans ask questions like, was the United States an empire? Was intervening in other countries a democratic ideal? Now, the Spanish-American War and Philippine War were two different wars. Sometimes they are confused because in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. did fight in the Philippines, but they are two different wars. In the Spanish-American War, it was a global war that took place in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam. The Philippine-American War started a year and a half after the Spanish-American War, and it was fought between the United States and the Filipinos. So the Philippine-American War began because Filipinos rejected the Treaty of Paris, which was from the Spanish-American War, which gave the United States the Philippines. So at one point in American history, the Philippines belonged to the United States. Now, Spanish-American War, what caused it? Since the mid-1800s, Cubans had tried to win their independence from Spain. Let's start there. But in 1895 to 1898, Cuba had a war of independence, and it was an attempt by the Cubans to win independence from Spain. Now, the Spanish general put the Cubans into military camps. So they had a very powerful general at the time, and he put them into camps for 2 years. And newspapers printed sensationalized stories about this conflict in Cuba. And Cubans in the United States were saying stuff like, Cuba Libre, liberate Cuba. Now, the president at the time was a guy named President McKinley, and he was concerned about Americans and American property in Cuba. And many Americans, they were invested in sugar and plantations in Cuba at that time. McKinley, he sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana, Cuba. And this battleship was in the Havana harbor for 2 weeks. And on February 15th, 1898, an explosion destroyed the battleship, the USS Maine, killing 250 people. The United States would blame the explosion on the Spanish. So there was a crying or a saying at that time called the "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." So a lot of people were blaming Spain for this explosion. Before a proper investigation of the explosion of the battleship USS Maine had been conducted, people were shouting for war. There was something called yellow journalism, which was influencing people. Uh, so it told people that it was the Spanish that we need to fight, right? It had reports of concentration camps in Cuba, which many were actually true. There was some death estimates of up to 150,000, 400,000 people who died at the hands of the Spanish in Cuba. But the yellow journalism made it all more exaggerated and influenced how people felt. And they wanted to go to war. So on April 20th, 1898, McKinley signed a joint congressional resolution demanding the Spanish withdraw. April 21st of that same year, Spanish cut diplomatic ties with the U.S. On April 25th of the same year, Congress officially declared war. On the same day, the U.S. Navy began a blockade of Cuba. Now, historians today question how much of an influence yellow journalism really had on the war. Now, at this time, there's something called the Teller Amendment. So this is an amendment to the Congressional um, Declaration of War on Spain. So it placed a condition on American military presence in Cuba at that time. It said the U.S. would not annex or add Cuba to the U.S., which some people wanted. The U.S. would just help Cuba gain independence and then withdraw troops from Cuba. It was passed to let the Cubans know that the U.S. would not take over their country. The U.S. would later pass the Platt Amendment that gave the U.S. power over Cuba. Now, the Spanish-American War, May 1st, 6 days after the U.S. declared war in Spain, Commodore George Dewey attacked the Spanish fleet outside Manila, Philippines, which was a Spanish colony on the other side of the world. So Dewey sailed from Hong Kong, which was a British colony, and took the entire Spanish fleet out. And the U.S. would get assistance from Filipinos who didn't want the Spanish to colonize them anymore. And then the U.S. blockaded Manila Harbor. This is known as the Battle of Manila, Philippines. It was the first battle of the Spanish-American War. And 1 month later, the American troops would land in Cuba. So to make this less confusing, the war is against the Spanish. And it started in Cuba with the sinking of the USS Maine, but the first battle was in the Philippines, and so in Cuba and the Philippines both belonged to Spanish, and that's who the Americans were fighting. On July 1st, 1898, 2 months after Manila, the U.S. took San Juan Heights in Cuba, and they won largely because of the Rough Riders, which was a voluntary group led by Theodore Roosevelt, a later president. In July 17th, 1898, the United States victory at Santiago de Cuba, this was going to end the war. And on August 12th, Spain and the United States agreed to a ceasefire. The Treaty of Paris of 1899 is what ended the Spanish-American War. Spain gave up its claims to Cuba, so they're out of the Western world at this time. Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam went to the United States. The United States still has territory in Puerto Rico and Guam, but not the Philippines today. It marked the end of the Spanish Empire. Now note, the Spanish dominated the New World for centuries since first arriving in 1492. Over time, independence movements would free countries from Spanish rule in the Western Hemisphere, and this is going to end their empire altogether. Secretary of State John Jay famously called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war because it only lasted 15 weeks. Less than 400 Americans died in battle, but typhoid and yellow fever and malaria took the lives of around 4,000 Americans. The significance of this war was the United States became a dominant power in the world. It was the start of what some Americans coined the American Empire. Debates have spread throughout the United States about the role of the United States in the world. Anti-Catholic sentiments grew in the U.S. because Spain was Catholic. So a lot of people didn't like the Spanish at the time, but it should be noted that there was always this anti-Catholic feeling ever since the beginning of the United States because many of the early Americans were Protestants. As I mentioned earlier, there was the Platt Amendment too. So this was stipulated as in 1901 after the war. It stipulated conditions for the United States to withdraw troops in Cuba after the Spanish American War had ended. Cuba must sign a treaty to accept these conditions. It defined terms of a relationship between Cuba and the United States on unequal terms, with the U.S. able to dominate Cuba. And Cuba's new constitution at that time included terms of the Platt Amendment. The United States would be able to intervene in Cuban affairs and be able to lease land for naval bases in Cuba, for example, Guantanamo Bay. So Guantanamo Bay, which is still used today, after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. founded the naval base Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And it's located in the southeast of Cuba. In 1903, it was first leased by the U.S. as a coaling station and naval base. It is the oldest overseas U.S. naval base. In 2002, many years later, 100 years later, during the War on Terror, George Bush established the Guantanamo Bay detention camp at the naval base. Now, the Philippine-American War, which, again, don't be confused between this and the Spanish-American War, because they were fought in the Philippines, but this is against the Filipinos, right? So 1 year and a half after the Spanish-American War came the Philippine-American War. The 1898 Treaty of Paris from the Spanish-American War transferred the Philippines from Spain to the U.S. The U.S. would replace Spain as the colonizers of the Philippines. The Philippine-American War began because the Philippines objected to the terms of the Treaty of Paris. They wanted independence. They didn't want a new colonizer. So the war was from 1899 to 1902, and there were some bloody battles. The United States was not used to guerrilla warfare style, and they were also not familiar with the Filipino terrain. Between 4,000 and 6,000 Americans died, and between 16,000 and 20,000 Filipinos died. Between 250,000 and a million Filipino civilians died, and mostly it was from famine and disease. An American victory changed the culture of the Philippines. Protestantism would become more influential than Catholicism, which was the Spanish. And the English language would also become more popular. The Philippines would be an American colony until 1946. Now, here's the irony: the Philippines first fought against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. They fought against the country that helped them liberate them from the Spanish. Now, at this time, there was something that was known as white man's burn. It was popularized as the idea that Westerners had a Christian duty to bring the benefits of their superior, with quotation marks, civilization to less fortunate people of the world. And this was a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and it was about the Philippine-American War. That's where it comes from. It should be mentioned that in 1898, the same time as the Spanish-American War, the United States would also annex Hawaii, the island in the Pacific Ocean. And they did it for trade, so they could get some resources like sandalwood. They would also plant sugar there as well. And it was also an easy stopping place to get to China, who they wanted to train with. So it was actually taken over by businessmen, and then the U.S. would take it over in 1898. And they would put naval bases there and military bases there as well. For example, Pearl Harbor, which is going to be important for World War II. Now, there was just something at this time period called the Anti-Imperialist League. So it was originally established to go against intervention in the Philippines. Many people believe that imperialism was against American non-intervention ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, George Washington's farewell address, and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. American Anti-Imperialist League would ultimately fail, as new politicians would push for further American expansion. The U.S. would become a powerful force in the world. Members of the Anti-Imperialist League included Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, and William Jennings Bryan. So there are patterns of American interventions. So the U.S. intervened in other countries for the purpose of protecting American economic interests. For example, Mexico, China, Middle East, and other areas around the world. American ships had been traveling to China since 1784. And remember, the Spaniards that traveled to the Western Hemisphere in the late 1400s, Columbus, they were looking for Asia, right? So in the 1800s, business with China was relatively small, but Americans felt access to the American market was important. When the United States felt access to the Asian market was threatened, it prompted intervention. So, for example, there was something known as the Perry Expedition to Japan. So, decades before the Spanish American War, President Millard Fillmore commissioned Commodore Matthew Perry to use the Navy to persuade Japan to open their ports to American trade. By this time, commerce with China had been growing, and American whalers were off the coast of Japan already. In 1854, Perry and the Tokugawa shogunate, sorry for my pronunciation, signed a treaty to end Japanese isolationism, opening the ports to American ships. And Americans were ensured safety in Japan, and an American consul was established in Japan. This is going to lead a little bit later to the open door policy of 1899. This is an important one. The United States had desire to do business with China. In September 6, 1899, Secretary of State John Jay dispatched the open door note to the European countries to keep China open to equally trade with all countries. It's to prevent from one country totally controlling China. There was a fear that Japan, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, or Russia would carve China into spheres of influence. All countries were to refrain from interfering from any treaty port and allow Chinese authorities to collect tariffs on an equal basis. It won support with those who opposed imperialism. It protected China's sovereignty. China was not partitioned like Africa, which was known as a scramble for Africa, which was between 1881 and 1914. It did not have legal standing, but it was not violated. Now, there's something in China called the Boxer Rebellion. This was in 1900. The Boxers were these people in northeast China. They resented the Christian missionaries that had from Europe and the U.S. that had been in China. They also resented some of the foreign businessmen in China. And Boxers, well, that was the English name for these martial arts specialists. In English, people call them Chinese Boxers. During a severe drought, Boxers attacked and murdered foreigners in one of the provinces in China in the northeast. The Boxers went to Beijing and besieged the legation quarter where there were many foreigners and Chinese Christians. There was an eight-nation alliance which intervened with this attack on the foreigners by the Boxers. It included Americans, Austro-Hungarians, British, French, Germans, Italian, Japanese, and Russians. The eight-nation alliance would defeat the Imperial Army of China, and there were 100,000 total deaths in the conflict, and that includes civilians and soldiers. So at that time, the president was McKinley, and he sent the U.S. Army to China to put down the Boxer Rebellion without the consent of Congress. This started a trend for U.S. presidents sending troops into action as an executive order instead of having the consent of Congress. Another example of American interventionism was during the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1920. There was a dispute on the leadership there, and there was internal conflict. And one of their leaders was a man named Pancho Villa, and he actually went into the U.S. and attacked some people in New Mexico in the state. So it was a bloody revolution in Mexico, and with Pancho Villa coming to the U.S. and the U.S. Taking sides in that revolution, troops were sent into Mexico. And this was just another example of the willingness of the United States to intervene in foreign countries. Now, of course, at the same time, there's going to be World War One, which will be for another unit. But I would like to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and American imperialism. So Roosevelt, one of the most famous American presidents, he came to office and had many ambitions as a global power. He wanted to be a military might. He wanted territorial expansion. He wanted economic influence. And though the Spanish American War, 1898, started under President McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt became the face of American imperialism. So he'd be the president after McKinley. Now, first, let's talk about McKinley. He died on September 6, 1901. And this was 6 months after his second term had began. He was assassinated by an anarchist. The guy's name was Leon Chalgash. He was a recluse who lost his job in the Panic of 1893, which was a depression, and he believed there was this great injustice in society, where the wealthy could exploit the poor. Nonetheless, McKinley was killed, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt would become the next president. Now, Roosevelt, he was a statesman, a conservationist, a naturalist, an adventurer, historian, a writer. He wrote about the War of 1812, and he was the 26th president of the U.S. And as a child, he grew up sickly. He was able to overcome his health problems and become very strong. He attended Harvard. Like I said, he wrote a history about the War of 1812. Under McKinley, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was a Rough Rider during the Spanish-American War, so he was a leader in the Spanish-American War. And after President McKinley's vice president, Gerrit Hobart, died, Roosevelt would become vice president, and then he would become president after McKinley was assassinated. Theodore Roosevelt also built up the military. Between 1904 and 1907, he built 11 battleships, and between 1907 and 1909, he built the Great White Fleet. And that was 16 white battleships that sailed around the world, showcasing American power. So it was more for showing off how powerful the U.S. was, and that's what Roosevelt wanted to do. Now, Roosevelt is famous for saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." And this was the big stick policy by Roosevelt. And it was basically the U.S. could protect its hegemony over important locations in the Western Hemisphere. And they needed to be strong militarily, specifically with the Navy, and that could force potential enemies to pay close attention to the U.S. Theodore Roosevelt is famously known for the Panama Canal. So in 1901, Roosevelt helped Panama win its independence from Colombia just for the purpose of building a canal. In fact, the French had tried to build it before. It was very difficult because the terrain and they failed. Many people died while trying to build it. But in 1902, Roosevelt bought the French assets in the canal zone for $40 million. And he signed a treaty with Panama, giving the U.S. permanent possession of the Panama Canal. And it wouldn't be until 1914 that the canal was finished. And today, the canal saves ships an average of 22 days by not going around South America. And there's more than 14,000 ships that go through the Panama Canal every year. Now let's talk about the Roosevelt Quarterly. This was articulated by Theodore Roosevelt in the 1904 State of the Union Address, and it reaffirmed the Monroe Doctrine from 1823. And the U.S. had the right to preemptively take action in Latin America. That's what it said, right? And the U.S. would intervene in conflicts between European and Latin American countries. So think of this as Monroe Doctrine number 2. Now, immigration, imperialism, and industrialization were all linked. So, for example, American imperialism wanted markets for American goods. Those goods were often manufactured by immigrant labor in the U.S. And the United States depended on foreigners to produce. And what I mean by foreigners, I mean immigrants making the products, and foreigners to consume, other countries to buy the products. So between 1870 and 1920, 25 million immigrants came to the U.S. So between the 1870s and 1920s, laws were executed that limited certain immigrant groups. In 1875, there was the PAIDS Act, which was passed. It convicted criminals from Asia. Were not allowed to immigrate to the United States. And then in 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So this was signed underneath President Chester Arthur. And all Chinese laborers were banned from immigrating to the United States. It was only a law in American history that prevented members of a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. Now, immigration policies. So, since colonial days, individual states were responsible for regulating immigrants. In the 1880s, control of regulating immigration transferred from the states to the federal government. In 1882, there was the Immigration Act, and it denied immigrants who could not support themselves, and it also denied immigrants who had mental illnesses or were convicted criminals. Um, and since the colonial days, people like Catholics were not welcome in the United States. That would change over time, right? And there was also anti-Irish and Italian sentiment, as I said earlier. Um, yeah. So today the policy is by the federal government, but at one time it was by the states, and then it would move to the federal government like it is today. Now, here's my final thought on today's lesson. In George Washington's farewell address in 1796, Washington said that the United States should not intervene in foreign affairs. And 102 years later, the United States would become an empire, involving itself in the affairs of other countries. The Spanish American War was that turning point in American history because it was when the United States became a world power. Thank you so much for watching this lesson today. And please, if you're interested, check out the Lesson in Humanities store. The link is in the description below.